Can you all hear me? That's good. Well, it's an absolute delight to be here to introduce Roy Taylor. Roy and I go back a number of years, like 3 decades actually. We used to be clinicians over at the RVI. I think you still are a clinician over at the RVI, but I have retired from clinical work. It's a real honour for me to introduce him because I know Roy pretty well actually. He is one of those really outstanding academic clinicians who has continued his research work, his teaching and his clinical work over many, many years and to a very high level. You will see, I think, that he has made major contributions to diabetes research. I can remember many years ago he started off the retinopathy screening program, which is now spread out throughout the whole of the UK, and it's made a huge difference to diabetics and their vision. And I think we're going to hear this evening of his more recent work, which has spanned, I don't know, probably the last 8 or 10 years, Roy, which I think is going to be very, very interesting. I'm looking very much to hearing from him. So I think without spending a lot of time talking about his background in, I don't know, Edinburgh was it? And the many years he's had here, I'd like to ask him to come up and give his lecture on reversing the irreversible, type 2 diabetes and you. Roy.
Thank you very much, Peter. Ladies and gentlemen, type 2 diabetes seems really very complicated. There's so much information about it. These bits of information are different in nature, they're rather scattered at different levels. In fact, you might say they're rather like the bridges of the Tyne, different in nature, scattered, and at different levels. But standing at one particular place, it's possible to line up the bridges of the Tyne. And what I'd like to do in this lecture is to try and line up recent information about type 2 diabetes to try and make it a bit more of an understandable condition. We ought to review, first of all, the beliefs about type 2 diabetes. Just what kind of a disease is it? Well, if you were to stop a GP in the street and say, what is type 2 diabetes? He or she might answer, well, it's a disease of obesity and it gets steadily worse and worse. It's lifelong and you need to add more and more medication, and she may well shake her head and hurry on. Well, are his thoughts justified? Let's look at 2 pieces of the information that supports that. First of all, oh, how interesting. First of all, the Nurses' Health Study, quite a remarkable study. This followed up 250,000 young women over several decades. And the point of this slide is that those people whose BMI, body mass index, was quite high, these are quite severely obese women, had a almost 40 times increased risk of getting diabetes compared with those who are slim. So, yes, it seems to be at least associated with obesity. Seem to have an interesting flag. Secondly, how about the natural history? What happens to type 2 diabetes over time? Now, in this graph, we have control on this axis, so normal blood glucose is down here, getting higher and higher, so this is poor control up here, good control down here. This study, the United Kingdom prospective diabetes study, followed up people who are newly diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and did so for 15 years. Quite a remarkable study in itself. And what it found was those people who were assigned to intensive control, in fact, did get good control. But despite the best efforts of the really rather expert doctors that were looking after them up and down the UK, there was a steady, inexorable rise in blood glucose, loss of control. And indeed, these lines only plateau because at 10 years, 50% of this group were already on insulin therapy. The people who had ordinary control actually showed the same rate of decline of control, even though they didn't have the initial benefit. So in other words, despite the best efforts of the doctors using treatment, this is the slow, steady path of deterioration. And you might say, well, what underlies that? From the same data set, it was possible to see, because if we measure the insulin secretion rate, the ability of the pancreas to make insulin in type 2 diabetes, you can see at the time of diagnosis, we're already 50% down. People without diabetes would, by definition, have 100% of beta cell or insulin secreting cell function. And what happened over the next few years was a linear fall, a dismal downward trend. And this, more than any other piece of information, has determined views on type 2 diabetes. Those of you who've been to your doctor and been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes may well have been told, I'm afraid it's lifelong, you need to get used to it, and you'll need increasing amounts of treatment, so you need to get used to that too. And by the way, there's a risk to eyesight and kidney function, and we don't really mention the amputation and heart disease and stroke. It's not a pleasant condition in terms of its risks to health. And the fact that it's known to be inexorably progressive and lifelong is very bothersome. In fact, after you leave the diabetes centre, you may well wonder if around the doorway isn't written a message such as, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." It may well be. However, in the 1960s, we started doing, not we personally, but the profession started doing operations, bariatric surgery operations for severe obesity. And very early on it was recognised that type 2 diabetes may go away. So when these people were seen a year or two later, they were of course no longer severely overweight and the diabetes had gone. And this has been known and thought to be entirely unremarkable. As the fatness goes, the diabetes goes, so what? But then, the piece of information that riveted my attention was published in 2006. This study by Caterina Guidoni and her colleagues followed the change in fasting plasma glucose after gastric bypass surgery. But just look at the time base. Weeks. 1 week after the operation, plasma glucose was normal. Now, plasma glucose in type 2 diabetes doesn't do that, yet it did. And a few weeks later, it was still normal. So, what was going on here? Well, these researchers suggested that it was because of the operation on the gut, it was changing the balance of the gut hormones, and this was widely believed to be the case. But at the time, I'd been puzzling over why the liver was often abnormal in diabetes. The liver function tests are just borderline abnormal. And these thoughts have been going around my mind together with just what happens to food. And so when I looked at this, I saw a completely different picture. These people were not folk with ordinary type 2 diabetes. These were people who were going for bariatric surgery. Their mean body weight was 152 kilograms, 24 stone each. And we know how much food these people would have to eat in order to maintain their weight steady. Now, large animals need to eat more food than small animals. It's just a law of nature. All that massive living tissue needs to keep going. And we can calculate that these people must have been eating at least 3,500 calories a day just to level peg. So the huge change which happened on the day of operation was that there was a sudden onset of calorie restriction from at least this sort of level. What had happened to reduce the blood glucose perhaps was not related to the skill of the surgeon, but was related to the nurse coming along the night before and hanging a notice on the bed, "Nail by mouth." Well, that's an interesting idea, But we need to examine it in a bit more detail. So what is this food doing anyway? Let's just consider some food. Nice gourmet food, even wine. But rather prosaically, the body sees this beautiful food merely in terms of glucose or fat. Metabolism is basically quite simple. You might say, but how about the protein? Well, excess protein just gets the nitrogen locked off and is thrown into the glucose pool. How about the alcohol? There it is, quite a lot of calories in that glass. That just gets metabolized as fat. So we can see this in very simple terms. If a person takes in the fat, then it has to be dealt with by the body. And what the body does is to process it in the liver, put it out in clever particles in the blood, very low density lipoproteins, but we don't need to bother about that, just fat in the blood, and it will go off largely to adipose tissue to be stored, but it's also distributed in other tissues. But if in the course of a day you happen to take in more glucose or sugar, then you can either burn for energy or store in your very limited glycogen stores. The body's only got one way of dealing with it. In the liver, there is a pathway called lipogenesis. In other words, the making, genesis, of lipid. And this synthesis of glucose into lipid results in the fat being made in the liver. And again, it's just a fact of nature that fat made in this way is naturally destined to be stored inside the liver cells until it's redistributed. So, we've got a problem here. If a person in the course of 24 hours takes in too much, then we will have just a very slight but finite increase in the amount of fat stores in the liver. Bearing in mind this simple explanation of metabolism, we can then put together what Katrina Godoni and a colleague showed with an understanding of type 2 diabetes. So, having read that article, and after drawing a few diagrams for myself, this is how it looked to me, theoretically. It seemed to me that type 2 diabetes would only ever develop if there had been positive calorie balance over a long period of years. It doesn't have to be very great, but it has to be positive. And that would result in the laying down of excess fat in the liver. If these people happen to be insulin resistant, maybe not doing much exercise, perhaps a little fat to start with, perhaps just a fact of family history, because it does run in families, then this pathway will be stimulated even more, because lipogenesis, that pathway, is actually stimulated by insulin if it's around. So, we have this high liver fat. What's it going to do there? Well, in terms of glucose, this is quite important. We've known for a decade or more that if there's too much fat in the liver, then the insulin control of glucose metabolism is inhibited. That would mean that plasma glucose levels would tend to rise just very slightly. But in response, some insulin would be made, so the level of insulin just goes up a little bit. But that is going to stimulate this process. So you can see that we have a vicious cycle that will be turning ever so slowly, but inexorably, as long as positive calorie balance continues. But the fat in the liver doesn't just stay there. It will be exported in the form of these fat particles, and these fat particles distribute fat throughout the body. One tissue which will take up the fat very avidly is the pancreas. And the islets in the pancreas, which is where the insulin secreting cells are particularly affected. So there will be an increase in fat in the islet. Why should that matter? Well, we know from experiments about islets in the test tube, if we add fat first, that will inhibit the secretion of insulin. So here we see that the islet fat will in fact diminish the response to food. Plasma glucose will tend to go up further, and so this background insulin level rises further, stimulating this whole process, and so these twin cycles grind onwards. Bear in mind, this is over years, maybe a decade or two. But eventually, the system breaks down. This can no longer cope. plasma glucose levels rise relatively rapidly. And the most recent data following the path to the diagnosis of diabetes confirms this. Plasma glucose levels are very slightly raised over about 10 years. Then, within about 18 months, there's a relatively rapid rise. All of this is hypothesis. This is armchair philosophy. So we need to do something about it, because it's all very well having thoughts, but we need information. So I needed to translate this into a hypothesis, one that could be tested. So to test the twin cycle hypothesis, I said substantial weight loss in people with type 2 diabetes will do two things. It'll affect the liver and the pancreas. In the liver, the decreased fat will improve insulin action, and it will normalize overnight blood glucose, blood sugar. In the pancreas, this will allow the pancreas to go back to normal insulin secretion. So, there, I've tied my colours to the masthead. We have a testable hypothesis. We can prove that I'm wrong or prove that I'm right. And what we did was to design the study to do this. Now, at this point, I would point out that the study was funded with a project grant from Diabetes UK. Without that funding, research doesn't go forward. And while we're mentioning Diabetes UK, I'd also acknowledge the role of the Newcastle upon Tyne Diabetes UK branch, who proposed this lecture. So here we are. The counterpoint study involved a very low-calorie diet over 8 weeks. And what we did was to measure at various time points before and then during this study several factors. The insulin control of glucose, which we can test, the amount of fat in these organs, and also the insulin response, the secretion response from the pancreas. Now, of those three things, the one that might raise the eyebrow is how on earth do you measure the liver and pancreas fat? Well, let me introduce you to the Magnetic Resonance Centre. This is on the site of what used to be the General Hospital, is now the Campus for Ageing and Vitality, a wonderful CAV for short. And inside this building, beside our lovely flowering cherry tree, which we've proudly preserved despite all the building work, we have our magnet. This is a more powerful magnet than usually used for scans, but it's not the magnet that's the magic. The magic is what we're able to do with it by virtue of our physicists. Andy Blaemeyer is Professor of Magnetic Resonance Physics, and his colleagues, Pete and Kieran, reader and lecturer in Magnetic Resonance Physics, can program our instrument to make it do things that it's never done before. So we tackle important questions of health in as diverse fields as dementia, heart disease, liver disease, other muscle diseases, and try and take forward understanding in various areas. What I'll tell you today relates just to our work in diabetes. So how can we get at the pancreas? Now, it's almost been designed as an organ that's playing a practical joke upon specialists in diabetes. It's at the back of the abdomen, it's horribly indistinct, a bit floppy, it moves in multiple planes, and is very difficult to study. There it is in outline. Let me just orientate you. This is looking as though we had cut a person across here. The head is away from us, and we're looking up from the feet. So on the right-hand side here, we have the liver, and here is a tummy wall, there is a backbone. So the pancreas. How can we get the chemical information out of the pancreas? Well, magnetic resonance depends upon getting a signal from the inside of the hydrogen atom. Now, that hydrogen atom can be in water, of course, or it can be in fat. And information can be acquired, which relates to both, but by a clever method, we can exploit the differences in behavior of the atomic nucleus when it's holding hands as part of a water molecule, compared with holding hands as part of a fat molecule. And because of that, Kieran was able to devise a technique whereby we could do an entire scan just on the fat. And so there the subcutaneous fat is white, but here it's black. And that's because it's a water scout. We're measuring only the hydrogen atoms in water. So there's very little water in subcutaneous fat, so it's a different colour. This means that every little dot in space, and bear in mind these pictures are merely made up of tiny dots, each of which represents a concentration by its colour. We can now express a percentage of fat over the water and derive a fat fraction. And with this horribly irregular gland, we can get information from that volume of tissue and find out the amount of fat. So that was a special bit of magnetic resonance that underlay this study. But let's get back to the study itself. I said we were going to use a very low-calorie diet for 8 weeks. That seems entirely improbable. Who's going to stick to that? And what are we going to give them? Well, this is what we gave them. Packets of powdered meals, so it's very defined. There's no question about calculating what amount you're going to have for a meal. It's one packet. There's breakfast, there's lunch, and there's dinner made up in a pint of water. You can see right away the problem with this diet, one of rather great boredom, despite the fact that this might be banana flavoured, or chocolate flavoured, or even soup flavoured, but rather tedious. The good news, however, is that after about 36 hours on this diet, sensations of hunger do disappear, and so people are not bothered by hunger in the way that people on marginal calorie restriction are. So that was why we chose this. In addition, excitement of excitements, they could have non-starchy vegetables to a certain amount. So here we have 600 calories defined, plus an extra 100 or so from non-starchy vegetables. That's a diet. And the question we have to ask is, did it work? Well, these are the data on the weight. Starting at 104 kilograms, this group of people with type 2 diabetes, shown in yellow, 11 people, showed a very steady loss of weight, which was 15 kilograms over the 8 weeks. That was about 2.5 stone. That's what we expected to be able to move considering our diet. Now, this was achieved not particularly by me, but by Elim Lim, Dr. Elim Lim, research fellow at the time, whose energy, organisation and sheer hard work allowed this study to happen. So what Elim had done was to set the scene. Remember, we're testing an idea, a hypothesis. We've reduced the weight. Did it really affect glucose in the way that I thought it might? Here's a plot of plasma glucose over the 8 weeks of the study. And in yellow, you can see the dramatic fall in the first week, 7 days, of starting the diet, from 9.2 to 5.9 millimole per litre, entirely normal. I must say, I was astonished at these results. But no time to be astonished, we need to find out what's causing this. Now, from the explanation of what went before, you might expect that this was changes at the level of the liver. So let's look at the amount of fat in the liver, how that changed, and its response to insulin. Here we see the effect of our 7 days of diet, and the liver fat started off to be high in our diabetic subjects. Now, in red, I've shown the values for a group of matched people for weight and age and sex, but without type 2 diabetes. So that red line is always the normal. You can see that in 7 days, liver fat has fallen, in fact, by 1/3, but has come back exactly to normal. The insulin control of glucose production started off as being distinctly subnormal, but in fact, within 7 days, had bounced up to being completely normal. So the liver is very sensitive to this matter. You might say, why does the liver fat go down so fast? Well, it is in fact a sort of current account for energy. If you need to have energy now, if someone shouted fire and we needed to move out of the room, you would burn your glycogen stores. But if you needed to keep on running for a few hours, you would be calling upon your liver fat stores as relatively accessible stores of energy. Now, it didn't just stop there, because of course these people were on the diet for 8 weeks, not 1 week. So let me show you what happened to liver fat content, baseline and up to 8 weeks. And these two scans are from the same person at baseline and after the study. And we've color-coded each little dot. So if it's 100% fat, it would be red. If it's 100% water, it would be black. And all shades in between. So the subcutaneous fat again, of course, is largely fat. It's red. Look at the liver here. This nasty bluish-green colour, oops, over here, is in fact 36% fat. This was one of the fatter livers that we happened to come across. But look at the liver 8 weeks later. We had stripped out the fat from the liver. No wonder we were seeing such big changes in metabolism. Down to 2% liver fat. Now, the usual saying is that 5% liver fat is normal. Let's switch to the pancreas. And in this slide, Meijun, research nurse extraordinaire, is carrying out an insulin secretion test. But before we describe the insulin secretion test, let me just point out that this particular volunteer is halfway through his low-calorie diet. Look at his smile. People tend to be so pleased that they've been successful in losing weight and very delighted that the plasma glucose levels have come down. So this isn't such a tough course as all that, although I would not wish to minimize the fact that it is a very substantial undertaking. Let me explain the insulin secretion test. It is just a little complicated, but on this graph I've plotted the insulin secretion rate. So when we raise plasma glucose, normal non-diabetic subjects have a big glucose insulin response. So insulin comes whizzing out to deal with this, and then we raise the glucose a bit more, a little bit of and then here we inject a bolus of a protein substance, in fact an amino acid, which stimulates insulin secretion maximally. So here we've got the glucose being raised, insulin has this first phase insulin response, and here we have the total response. Let me just point out that that goes up to about 1.2 of these units. Bear that in mind. And now we'll look at diabetes. At baseline, people with diabetes have got no first phase insulin response. Again, we've known this for a long time. And we also know that there's nothing that brings it back. Well, some tablets, the glycoside type tablets, can produce a minute increase in the first phase response, but not very much. So there we are. And there's a fairly pathetic total response. But let me just show you what happened after 1 week, and just follow this peak. Hello, there's something happening there. 4 weeks, 8 weeks. By the end of the study, the pancreas had woken up. This first phase insulin response was normal, and look at the total. About 1.4. Not significantly greater than the controls, but certainly up in the same range. And if we look at this plotted over time, this is a first phase response coming from very low up to well within the normal range. This happens in the same time course that the pancreas fat level gradually and slowly subsides back to normal. So we have two different processes that are going on at different rates in liver and pancreas. What happened next, I wasn't anticipating at all. When we published this information, my email inbox became filled with requests from many people who wanted to find out about this diet in order to try it for themselves. And I was surprised to come into the office in the MR Centre one day to find the secretaries had brought in a map of the world because they wanted to plot where all these requests were coming from. And so I took a picture of it. Here it is. From as far west as Hawaii, way down to New Zealand and the south and east, people were interested in finding out. Most requests, of course, coming from the UK. But it didn't end there, because in order to deal with these, I had to put the information on our website rapidly to get it out there to satisfy this demand for information. And then people started sending us the results of how they were doing. Now, we analysed the first batch of them that came in, there happened to be 77 of them, and you can see that in their own homes, people had lost 15 kilograms. The fasting blood glucose on average went from 8.3 down to 5.5. Now, I should point out this is an average, and this isn't a political seminar, so we can actually say exactly what was going on. Not everybody was normalised. 64%, in fact, of people achieved what we would recognise as being normal control. So about 2/3 of all people who tried it at home were able to get rid of their high blood glucose levels. But 100% of people said something quite remarkable, and that as doctors we don't quite have a good handle on. That is, they were hugely relieved to understand that this condition was not actually lifelong. There was a way of getting out of it. Even those people who had not been able to normalise their blood glucose were very pleased to have achieved whatever improvement they had. I should say that at the outset of this study, people stopped any tablet treatment they were taking, and that drop in blood glucose reflected stopping the tablets but changing the calories. Some people sent more than their data, and this man from Washington State, Carlos, and I mention his name because he's put an interview on the web that anyone can access describing his story. But basically, he was diagnosed as having type 2 diabetes in 2008. There's no doubt about the diagnosis. He had diabetes, presenting blood glucose 27 millimole per litre. And after a couple of years on tablets, he went on to insulin, and he was still on insulin in February 2011, when he weighed 120 kilograms. Now, he'd been having trouble off and on with foot ulcers, a bit bothersome. But what was even more bothersome was he couldn't sleep at night because he'd got diabetic neuropathy. And that's one of the worst things, burning pain, preventing sleep. But 2 days after this picture was taken, he had a heart attack. Subsequently, this became such a problem, he was threatened with possible amputation. Fortunately, that didn't come about. But he went home, really expecting that his life was over. And so, not being able to sleep, he just browsed the net and came across the research. And so he said, this is for me, and set about changing that 120 kilograms into this 74 kilograms. And here he is in July 2012. He still emails me and sends me his medical reports. And as of September, his glucose levels are entirely normal. But the favourite image of mine that he sent was this. This is his blood glucose meter. He took a picture of it and sent it to me. This is in American units. 75 milligram per decilitre is about 4.2 millimole per litre. Completely normal for a fasting blood glucose. But that was not fasting. That was an hour after eating a blueberry muffin. So here we have the blueberry muffin challenge test to show, yes, diabetes has gone. But let's just consider what we're talking about are really the results of one study. And to do this study, I had to define the individuals we chose. And I chose them to have diabetes duration of less than 4 years. And so what we've shown is that defects in liver and pancreas are reversible if you've only had diabetes for 4 years. And so this brings up the important question, can long duration diabetes also be reversed? Now, in order to answer that, Sarah Stephen joined me as research fellow, and she carried out a magnificent study funded by the Biomedical Research Centre on the Centre for Ageing and Vitality and Novo Nordisk. And what she did was to examine people, again with less than 4 years duration of diabetes, in 15 people this time, and she reproduced Elam's findings. The average blood glucose at the end of the 8 weeks was 5.8 millimole per litre. In long duration, the picture was much more mixed. Now, it looks like an awful mess, but let me just suggest to you that there are 3 major patterns of response. Some individuals behaved as though they still had short duration diabetes. Some individuals didn't respond at all. and some responded relatively slowly. So in longer duration diabetes, it's a mixed picture, and we need to understand more about this. If we express Sarah's data in terms of the duration of diabetes, you can see that the short duration group, by and large, responded fairly well. Not everybody, completely normal, but by and large a good response. But as time went by, certainly by 15 years, it looks like the horse has bolted. We can get further information on this process by looking at the results of bariatric surgery. In our region, we have a fantastic bariatric surgery service. Peter Small leads our regional centre from Sunderland, and this region does 10% of the entire bariatric surgery operations in the UK. You might say we need it, but nonetheless we do it. But just look at this. The percentage reversal of diabetes is relatively small if people only lose 10% or so of their body weight after bariatric surgery. In the range we've been looking at with our dietary studies, here 10 to 20% loss of body weight, then we get an interesting 44% reversal with this very mixed bunch of people going for bariatric surgery, some of whom have long duration diabetes. But if they lose more weight, then they have a much higher reversal of diabetes. So there is, if you like, a dose-response curve. The more weight you lose, the more likely it is that you will reverse your diabetes, at least up to about 25 kilograms. It doesn't seem to go up any further beyond a 30% weight loss. This brings us to an important question. Type 2 diabetes, can you reverse yours? Well, the first thing to ask is whether you really want to, because what we're talking about is a very substantial change in lifestyle. For at least 8 weeks, you don't change your lifestyle, you suspend it. You stop eating with the family, you stop going to the pub, you certainly wouldn't have a business lunch. So this is a serious undertaking. After the 8 weeks, the difficult bit starts, because then you have to change your long-standing habits and get used to eating about 2/3 of what you used to eat. So this is not a trivial undertaking, and it's probably not for everybody. So examining carefully whether a person really wants to do this is important. But if they do, the next question is, okay, duration. If it's under 6 years, there's a good chance of reversal. And extent of weight loss. Well, 15 kilograms is usually enough to reverse type 2 diabetes, but some people seem to need to lose more. Where's that taken us? Well, it's taken us to the point we know some things, but we also know that we don't know others. So we know that individuals who are motivated, who lose this weight, can lose their type 2 diabetes. But what would happen in general practice if people were advised to do this? What would happen if they did it partly and then didn't like it and stopped doing it? What would happen over a period of years? And this is where our current study comes in. Diabetes UK has funded the DIRECT study, Diabetes Reversal Control Trial, and this trial will randomise 30 practices both in this region and around central Scotland, because I'm doing this in collaboration with my colleague Professor Mike Lean in Glasgow. Those practices that are randomised to intervention will use a very low calorie diet approach. The practices randomised to control will continue business as usual. This is absolutely vital that we do this to get firm information on whether this is successful in the long term. The intervention practices, 140 people all told, will have very regular visits all the way through, as well as visits at intervals to do measurements, whereas the control people will just come along for the special measurements. So that's the design of the study. This again is funded by Diabetes UK. I would point out that this study is enormously expensive, £2.5 million. It's the biggest study that Diabetes UK has ever funded in its 78-year history. So this is very special. We need to make it work. And it's vital that we're able to get the answer to this question as to whether this is something that can be used routinely and advised by GPs as a matter of course, or whether it's something just for the highly motivated, selected individuals. Well, that's enough science for a moment. Let's go back to the quayside and have a walk around. Newcastle's got some very remarkable buildings. Here, standing in the middle of the swing bridge, you can look up, and it's the only place where you see the Castle Keep in conjunction with the cathedral. Castle Keep, built about 1180, immense structure, and this, a beautiful crown-topped cathedral, incidentally the furthest southerly crown-topped cathedral in the United Kingdom. That was put in place in 1492. They had rather good builders in 1492. But the beautiful buildings don't end there, because instead of going into Waterstones at the monument, you were to look up and see the top of the Emerson Chambers. You're looking at an architectural marvel. This was built as an office block, believe it or not, in 1903. It's Art Nouveau style with Gothic mixed in. Look at these little peaks up here. Marvellous building. But why the alarm clock on the side? Well, perhaps it's because a man standing nearby can't reach into his pocket to pull out his watch. Lord Grey is standing there on top of his monument. Now, Lord Grey is one of the outstanding men of Newcastle of the past. Prime Minister in the early 1830s. He got through Parliament, the Great Reform Act, which widened the electoral roll and led eventually to complete suffrage, universal suffrage. So he actually changed the country from the serfdom pattern before onto our modern democracy. But more than that, the following year, he actually managed to abolish slavery in the British Empire. An astounding feat of the time. And in turn, because of that, in a part of the British Empire, in India, one particular tea blender decided to name his latest blend of bergamot oil and tea after the person that was Earl Grey at the time. So next time you walk past the monument, just remember that here we have the origin of that very pleasant cup of tea. A truly great man, but not the only great man in Newcastle. Let me introduce you to another great man. If we walk down Grey Street and come to the corner of High Bridge and walk along High Bridge, you'll see the Duke of Wellington pub. In the 1870s, the Duke of Wellington pub had a publican that was by far the greatest man in Britain in terms of weight. William Campbell was the heaviest man by far at the time. His weight was very similar to that written in the Guinness Book of Records as the heaviest man in Britain, Daniel Lambert of Leicester. And he weighed pretty much the same, 52 kilograms. So here we have a guy that you might think, gosh, you know, what a greedy man. He's eaten far too much, should behave himself. But in fact, it's not quite like that, because if we look at his measurements in early life, at the age of 9 months, he weighed 3 stone. At the age of 10, he was 18 stone. Now, the point of telling you this story is to pull out the differences from this single gene disorder of appetite compared with the general population who have no such deficit. So he's likely to have had leptin deficiency. And these published pictures show quite nicely an infant, a person at the age of 3 weighing 42 kilograms. And you can see that this is due to lack of leptin, single gene disorder. Normally that inhibits appetite, and it's always evident in infancy. But as a single substance, we can now know what this is, synthesize it and inject it. So this child at the age of 3 looked like this at the age of 7. And you see, at the age of 7, he weighed 10 kilograms less because his voracious appetite had been switched off. Let me emphasize again, this is absolutely nothing to do with the ordinary obesity which we see in the population, being heavily researched. But next time you pick up a tabloid newspaper and in this penny shocker there's some awful story about some dissolute person who's weighing 52 stone, well, there might be a genetic cause for it. It's not part of the normal distribution. But what is part of the normal distribution is what you see on the streets. And again, if you come on a journey with me, this time back in time, these photographs that I'll show you were taken around 1980. Leszek Popdad was a keen amateur photographer. His entire collection is on archive in the City Library. Just look along this bus queue and spot the fat person. Not there. So from a whole queue. Now, of course, you might say, well, I selected a picture specially to show that. Well, not at all. Here we are at the bottom of Northumberland Street, near Brunswick Place. All the people are slim. The top of Northumberland Street, C&A, is where Primark's is now, and you can see that Marks and Spencer's was there because in the window you can read Marks and... These ladies were avidly heading for Marks and Spencer's, but that's not the point. Just look at their BMI. That'd be about 19, perhaps the same, 17, 21. This is an average crowd of shoppers in the 1980s. Now, if we consider contemporary images, then we might be thinking about something like this. Oop. Something like this. Here we see rather rounded individuals, and here we see images that are unremarkable on our streets now. Rather spookily, a lot of young people who are overweight. Now, just what's going on? If we consider wild animals, you'll find that they're virtually never obese. If you see a deer on the hillside, that deer won't be obese. And if you're up early in the morning and happen to see a fox cross your lawn, that fox won't be obese. Let's go down to Jesmond, to Pet's Corner. Here we see wild animals, but kept in captivity. So this is important because these notices tell a story. And the notices say, do not feed the animals, they're on a controlled diet. And that is really important. To keep animals in captivity, or if you like, domesticated, and keep them healthy, we need to ensure that they get just the right amount and not too much. I'm sure many of you have seen this sign down in Pet's Corner. But I wonder how many of you thought what it says on the other side of the sign. And you might wonder about this next time you walk down Northumberland Street. They are not on a controlled diet. Clearly, we have an environmental problem. But back to the science. Again, 1980. Let's just look at how the population measured up. We can see that here we have a graph of the percentage of the population that has any given body mass index. Let me tune you into this a little bit. We can say 25. Well, that defines a limit of normal weight. So a person with a BMI of 25 or less is said to be normal. And you'll see that the commonest weight in the population was in this region. And in fact, the average was 23 at the time. But with a BMI over 30, we would say these are obese people. Now, these are very convenient labels for epidemiology to be able to understand populations, and they allow us to describe what we see. So in 1980, 36% only had a BMI over 25. 7% were obese, BMI over 30. And with that 1980 data in mind, let's jump on to the most recent data in the recent report from the Chief Medical Officer. I've parked the 1980 data at the top there and lined it up with the 2010 data. And if we just look at the obesity, you can see how things have changed. So we've moved from 7% obesity to 25% obesity within the space of a single generation. This is a huge change in society. But all I've shown you is what's conventionally referred to and wondered about, this excess of obesity. But I want to show you the silent disaster. Just look here. There are no people. And yet, look where folk were in 1980. This is the commonest region for the population. And it's moved on. So what we're seeing is not a moderate minority of the population who are very fat. We're talking about a whole population who are a few pounds heavier than they might be. Now, we can store this information and use it to understand type 2 diabetes. It brings up the seminal question, and a question which those of you in the audience who are doctors will have been addressed to you at some time. And some of those people with diabetes may well have asked it. Why have I got type 2 diabetes? All my friends are fatter than me, and yet they don't have diabetes. Just what's going on here? In fact, it might even raise the question of whether this concept of obesity causing diabetes is correct. Is type 2 diabetes a disease of obesity? Let me introduce some doubts. If we look at people who are obese, 80% of them do not have diabetes. And if we look at people with diabetes, only a minority are actually in the obese range. So how can we understand this? Well, let's look at the BMI distribution of people with type 2 diabetes. Now, in this slide, I've shown the BMI distribution just like in the previous graphs, same sort of format, but instead of a single line to represent the population, that's epidemiology, enormously useful to describe populations. I want to get down to you. I want to get down to the individual. And you'll see that the commonest lineup of individuals is for a BMI of 28 to 29. That's the commonest BMI at which people develop type 2 diabetes. Some people, of course, have a high BMI, other people less so. But let's just move on, because this is now, and this is type 2 diabetes. So once again, let's park it at the top there, with these individuals piled up according to this BMI. Let's imagine a generation before, and these self-same individuals a generation before, if you like, their parent. Then the whole population would have been shifted in the same way that I showed that the mountain had shifted between 1980 and 2010. And that's the epidemiological explanation and the description. And the number of people who are obese, a lot here, well, very few here. But I want to take it further, because that's population. And in a medical consultation, there's usually only one patient. So let's look at the individual. Let me introduce you to Bill and Mary and Fred. Now, Bill had a very high BMI and diabetes, red dot. He lost 15 kilograms in weight and lost his diabetes, turned into a blue dot. Mary did the same. She lost just under 15 kilograms and lost her diabetes. And Fred went from there to there, again 15 kilograms weight loss, and became normal glycemic. Now, the epidemiologist might come along and say, but nothing's happened. This man is still obese. This woman is still overweight. Here we have someone who's normal. In fact, we might have someone who goes to their GP and the practice nurse looks at charts and says, you're a bit light, I'd put on some weight if I were you. So all of a sudden we see that we're dealing with a personal issue. We're dealing with a threshold effect and a degree of susceptibility. And this susceptibility will operate at the level of the liver and the pancreas as to how well individuals tolerate fat. Some people, of course, tolerate it superbly well. Others, much less so. So here we have Fred, who, if you like, has a threshold down here. If he was to put on weight again and cross that threshold, his diabetes will come back. Same with Mary, same with Bill. So let's abandon BMI as a measure. It's useful for populations, but it's misleading for the individual, and we need a phrase to describe what we're talking about. So I would suggest we're talking about the personal fat threshold. Difficult to measure in an individual, only by experience, but the concept, I believe, will take us forward and allow us to see what we're really seeing. This invisibility of the people who used to be slim and should be slim. So can we just revisit a slide I've shown you before? Was I pulling the wool over your eyes with this slide? Well, I want to point out that in the nurse's health study, this slide is almost always shown to make the 40-fold excess point I did. But that's not where the action is. The horrifying information is at the other end of the axis. Just look at this. These women who went from a BMI of, say, 21 to 24 have a 4-fold increased risk of getting type 2 diabetes. Now, in terms of relative risk, that is huge. Epidemiologists get excited if it's 1.2 or 1.5, 2-fold, almost causes apoplexy. 4-fold is equivalent to the risk of lung cancer caused by light smoking. So this movement of BMI from here to here is enormously deleterious. And now, having understood the personal fat threshold concept, you can fully appreciate the impact of this graph. So it's quite possible over the next few days you'll bump into people who say, well, I meant to go to the lecture, but I didn't make it. What did he say? Well, what did he say? Well, I think he said that excess food just day by day will inevitably silt up the liver, build up the liver fat, but just 8 weeks of diet can revert that to normal. And if you're going to reverse your diabetes, then duration matters. The extent of weight loss also matters. But the BMI distribution tells us a lot. Just look at these people represented here that are no longer here. And that leads directly to understanding this concept of the personal fat threshold, which is just what's going on at any one time. This is my bicycle. Or you might say my bicycle. This machine, of course, is controlled by the handlebars. But let's just consider that if it was diabetes, the controlling factors would be excess calories and a degree of insulin resistance. And as you all know, those factors will conspire to increase the level of fat in the liver. In turn, that's going to affect the control of insulin and glucose in the liver. And that will increase basal insulin secretion just a little and will potentially drive on this process of liver fat accumulation. And plasma glucose will rise just a little bit and push on the insulin secretion bit. And the liver fat doesn't just stay there, because it's passed out of the liver in these particles. So we have fat in the blood being delivered to the pancreas, where it will diminish the acute insulin response to food. And so these twin vicious cycles will grind onwards until a certain point when blood glucose levels rise rapidly. So come for a bicycle ride with me, ladies and gentlemen. Just imagine gripping the handlebars as you hurtle downhill, down the hill of life, and you look at your front wheel. It's going the wrong way round. Not good. But by adjusting the controllers on the handlebars of this excess calorie, type 2 diabetes, these cycles can be made to turn in the reverse direction. So, ladies and gentlemen, type 2 diabetes is potentially reversible. Thank you.
I thought that was totally brilliant. I think everyone in the audience must have enjoyed virtually the whole of that performance. I think now's the time to have some questions if you're prepared to answer them.
Certainly.
Yes, good. And I know there are 2 roving mics in amongst the audience, and I think we've got one question over there, and I'll try and go around as we go.
Thank you. Can I just ask you about your liquid diet? How useful is that to get people started? And is it possible for people to actually purchase it? Because you did say it reduced the appetite within 3 days, which I guess must be quite useful.
Yes, the liquid diet is very useful because it's a cut and dried amount. Now, virtually all supermarkets sell some sort of liquid meal replacement, and so it can be purchased. For this research, we used Optifast. It just happens to be a Nestle project. For some reason, it's quite hard to buy. Nestle donated it for the research with no strings attached. They had nothing to do with the research. So any liquid formula diet will do, but it's not essential. If you look on the website, you'll see that I suggest the first thing to do is consider whether you can do this merely by drastically reducing the amount you eat. You would have to stop eating the carbohydrate portion, no rice, pasta, potato, and probably half the meat portion. Carry on with the veg. That would take you down to about the sort of calorie deficit that would be useful in allowing you to lose weight without being incessantly troubled by appetite. But if you find it difficult to judge that, then the liquid diet is for you.
There and then there.
Once you've lost the weight, if you lose the weight, say after a month, do you have to keep on with the diet, or so you go down even further, or can you stop the program, or what should one do?
So the question is it necessary to go the full 8 weeks if you've lost substantial weight already? Not necessarily, but this is very difficult to generalize. It depends where you're starting from and all sorts of other factors. In general, most people who've got a diagnosis of diabetes will need to lose substantial weight. And so 2 stone, 2.5 stone is an approximate guide. It doesn't matter the length of time over which that weight is lost. So once the target is reached, and if blood glucose control is okay, then that could call it a day. But bear in mind that plasma glucose levels will go up a bit when going back to normal eating, because this is partly an effect of suddenly the pancreas coming back to normal, but also the effect of less food going in. So one needs to be a bit cautious about looking at the immediate blood glucose levels and saying, oh, I'm fine now. So in general, people will need to lose substantial weight. I think the 15 kilograms is a good touchstone. Now, if you happen to be starting off with a BMI of 21, it's quite likely you might get by with lesser weight. And in fact, when we look in detail at that old UK PDS data, we see that very clearly, because there was a period of weight loss in that, and we can look back and see that that's correct.
I think there was a question middle at the back.
Thank you. The weight loss studies seem to revolve solely around reducing calorific intake. Did it look at any way at all about whether any weight loss that might have come about through increased exercise as well, or is it purely about diet?
It's purely about diet, and we need to make a very clear point. Thank you very much for the question. It's really important. Exercise is completely misportrayed as a means of losing weight for people who have put on excess weight in middle life. It's just not an option, so we should forget it. If you happen to be 21 and you can run for 8 hours a day, fine, then it is possible to lose weight. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that exercise isn't important. It has independent positive benefits. It's what we encourage people to do. But not to confuse it with the means of losing weight. One loses weight almost entirely by reducing calorific intake. Once the weight has been lost, exercise, day-to-day physical activity, becomes a really important part of trying to establish the new steady state. And so that's where exercise comes in. Exercise to prevent weight gain. And we have really good evidence that exercise, day-to-day physical activity, is highly effective at that. Really, the enthusiastic sports medicine lobby has misportrayed exercise as applied to the, shall we say, overweight and middle-aged or older population.
Okay. question halfway up that row there.
Thank you. I just would like to ask whether you know if there's any association between the taking of statins to reduce cholesterol and the increase in blood sugar levels to such an extent that it could be problematic in type 2 terms.
Thank you. Yes, that's an interesting question. Statins are known to increase the risk of developing diabetes just very slightly. And to put it into context, statins have a major effect on reducing lipids and reducing coronary heart disease mortality. So it's got to be seen in perspective. But there's no doubt that this mechanism is real. So yes, we know the mechanism's there. We don't understand it. Once we've got to grips more with what's happening in the liver, just what's going on with this fat metabolism in general, we might be in a better position to understand it. But at the present time, we could say, firstly, people with type 2 diabetes in general are far better off on statins than not. Secondly, yes, people without diabetes may be nudged into it a little sooner than they would have been otherwise, but it doesn't cause it solely. Those people will have been well down the road already. So, yes, it's a problem. No, we don't know the mechanism.
And then there was a question right up in the corner.
I'm just interested in your views on the 5-2 fasting diet and whether you feel that for those perhaps who haven't yet developed type 2 diabetes but may be in danger of doing so, whether you think that is a good route to go, because it does seem to not only have quite successful weight loss, but the statistics on reducing insulin resistance seem very interesting as well.
Thank you. So the 5-2 diet. I wonder if I could comment just very briefly on different diets, because different diets tend to attract aficionados who find they've worked, and there is a sort of search amongst the, shall we say, the nutritionalists group in general to find the perfect diet. Now, I would suggest the perfect diet doesn't exist, because to every diet there's attached a human. And some humans suit some diets and others don't. When I first heard of the 5-2 diet, I couldn't imagine whom that would suit. And then some of my patients came in and said, actually, both myself and my husband are doing this, we find it great. Some individuals do very well on it, and if it suits them to eat very little on Thursdays and Sundays, or whichever days, that's fine. The only thing that matters in terms of what we've been discussing is average calorie intake over a period of time. So 5-2 diet, if it works for you, that's great and is highly successful, we know, in some individuals. It won't necessarily work for everyone. Low-fat diet may work for some people. Low-carbohydrate diet may work for rather more people. So we need to get away from what's been almost a fetish of the nutritionalist establishment, of trying to find the right way to eat and looking at the composition of diet. Composition of diet is a very individual thing. The only thing that matters in terms of metabolic health is weight gain.
Thank you. Are there more questions? There's one there and one down. This one first and then.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if, like in my instance, I weigh 52 kilos, and you said about dropping 15 kilos, would you still need to drop that amount of weight?
It's probably best to look at weight as percentage change, because you'll remember our initial group had a starting weight of about 100 kilograms, so 15% change for them was adequate. So I would suggest starting with relatively low weight. You should be looking at a percentage change. So yes, it would be less. And we know from observation, and I know from some patients, that in fact it's achievable with less in that weight range.
Good. I think we've got a question down here. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, buddy. I know that some of the fast this can be purchased online, and one of its ingredients is dried milk, and you mix it with water, But a lot of things that you purchase from boots and chemists and various things, they actually mixed with milk, depending on what you want. Is there any difference in that?
Right.
Could people? No, they couldn't.
Would you like repeat that? So, if I just rephrase the question, Optifast is made up with water, but a lot of the other proprietary products are advised to be made up with milk. Now, we've looked into this just recently, and in fact, that's fine, because if on the packet it says make it with semi-skimmed milk and this will give you 200 calories, you just do that. So, yes, follow the instructions on the packet to get whatever it says on the packet.
Is this to reduce visceral fat, which is one of the problems, isn't it?
Yes, the composition of what goes in is relatively unimportant. Bear in mind, we're talking about a very short period of time of weight loss, 8 weeks or so. There's no question of running into nutritional problems of trace elements or even most vitamins, although all of them are replaced in the liquid diets. So the composition is the least important thing, but finding a way of making it satisfactory for yourself so that you're satisfied with the skim milk and powder, that is really quite important.
The other thing is that some medical places, when you go to mining, some people...
Could you hold the mic a bit closer to your... That's it.
How long they've actually had a diabetes, don't they? Because some people never go to the doctors, then they go, then the doctors say, you've got diabetes. They may have had a slow build-up for several years. Does that make any difference to that?
It probably does, but bear in mind that the same factor applied to all the people recruited. So they too didn't know exactly when it started, and so we just have to use this rough estimate of date of recognition. And the comments about 6 years, etc., relate to the date of recognition, but you're quite right that the date of the onset of the sudden rise in blood glucose might have been before that.
Okay, we'll take 2 more questions. One corner there, and gentleman a little further forward.
Could I ask your opinion on the drug liraglutide that's been now prescribed, that was initially prescribed for diabetes, but now it's been peddled as the appetite suppressant and maybe used for obesity in the future?
Yes. Liraglutide is a synthetic form of one of the gut hormones, and it is quite successful in reducing appetite. It can reduce weight in some people with diabetes, not all, but at a higher dose it has been shown to be effective in obesity. But it's a moderately great effect. It's not the same drop of weight that we see with changing things. If I just perhaps draw this out a little and point out that we're really using natural means to achieve this. Now, I don't want to sound like an alternative medicine practitioner, although some of my specialist colleagues thought I was at first when this came out. Whereas using drugs, we're using magic bullets that do a single thing. And just by and large, they're less satisfactory in really getting all the benefits. So certainly a potentially useful adjunct to what doctors can use for dealing with overweight, but no replacement, as it were, for motivation and just realizing that the writing's on the wall.
And final question?
Would you expect any reversal or improvement in already established side effects? You mentioned the chap from America with neuropathy and ulcers.
Thank you. That's a really good question. The side effects of diabetes differ depending on the particular kind. If eye disease is at an early stage, we know that it can disappear. So that's encouraging. If eye disease is a bit more advanced, then no, it's going to be fixed. If the nerve damage is the commonest kind, which is loss of sensation in the toes steadily moving upwards, that will not reverse, or at least it's most unlikely to reverse, because that's due to blockage of the tiny capillaries supplying the nerve. But other complications, such as the painful neuropathy that Carlos had, yes, that's potentially susceptible to reversal. And the propensity to heart disease, yes, we will have changed Carlos's the risk of having another heart attack by a huge amount. So some of the complications, yes. The fixed tissue complications of advanced eye disease, beginnings of kidney disease, much less so.
Well, thank you very much, Roy, and thank you very much for participating from the audience. I think it's left to me, really, to thank you once again for a splendid lecture, Roy. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure everyone here did too. So thank you very, very much.